When people think of volcanoes, they often imagine tall cones spewing lava, but many volcanoes are actually hidden under the sea, and there are even some that are totally invisible. That is until you hear the terrifying roar of their eruption. These monsters can blow their tops off and send massive amounts of ash into the atmosphere. In fact, these supervolcanoes are so powerful that a single eruption can wipe out not just the surrounding area but entire continents. And while we're pretty lucky that none of them have blown recently, scientists predict that one will erupt again in the future. So here's how supervolcanoes work, why they're so dangerous, and what would happen if one erupted today. So what makes a volcano a supervolcano? Well, it has more to do with their history than their appearance. Specifically, it has to do with the explosiveness of past eruptions. To be considered a supervolcano, an eruption must have a volcanic explosivity index, or VEI, of 8. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens, which is one of the most active volcanoes in the United States, has a VEI of 5. So far, only 7 eruptions have ever been given a VEI of 8. And according to a study published in September of 2023, there may be many more. Researchers looked at satellite images and used machine learning to identify possible calderas, which are the craters left behind after a volcanic eruption. They found 47 new candidates and confirmed that 10 of them were likely caused by supervolcanic eruptions. Now you may be wondering, what exactly is a caldera? Well, it's basically a large volcanic crater. Calderas can form in a few different ways, but when it comes to supervolcanoes, they form after an explosive eruption. Calderas are also quite large. In fact, a new paper suggests that they need to be about 290 square miles or 470 square kilometers to be considered supervolcanoes. Some famous examples of supervolcanoes include Yellowstone National Park in the United States, Valles Caldera in Spain, Toba in Indonesia, and Taupo in New Zealand. Taupo is particularly interesting because it sits beneath Lake Taupo, which is home to the country's national rowing team training center. So if you ever find yourself training to be a competitive rower in New Zealand, keep your eyes peeled for signs of an eruption. But what causes these monstrous eruptions? Well, it starts with magma. Just like regular volcanoes, supervolcano systems contain large bodies of molten rock called magma chambers. However, unlike regular volcanoes, the magma chambers associated with supervolcanoes are extremely large and can stretch for dozens of miles. And while we think of magma as being hot and sticky, it's actually quite runny. This is because the magma found deep beneath supervolcanoes is actually quite dry. It's formed from the partial melting of ancient rock deep within the Earth's crust. This creates magma that is rich in silica, which makes it more viscous or sticky. But don't worry too much about the technical details. All you really need to know is that the magma beneath supervolcanoes is thicker than honey. This is important because the viscosity of the magma affects how easily gas bubbles can escape. And this is a critical factor in determining whether a volcano erupts explosively or not. You see, as the magma rises toward the surface, gas bubbles begin to form. As the pressure drops, these bubbles expand and make their way to the top of the magma. If the bubbles can escape quickly enough, then the eruption will be relatively gentle. But if the magma is thick, the bubbles get trapped and build up pressure. When the pressure becomes greater than the strength of the rocks surrounding the magma chamber, the result is an incredibly violent explosion. In fact, supervolcanic eruptions are so powerful that they can eject more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that into perspective, Mount St. Helens ejected about 1.2 cubic kilometers of material during its 1980 eruption. So, a supervolcanic eruption is thousands of times more powerful. And this material doesn't stay confined to the ground either. Supervolcano eruptions create ash clouds that can reach 50 kilometers into the atmosphere. To put that into perspective, commercial airplanes typically cruise around 10 kilometers above the ground. However, the material ejected during a supervolcanic eruption is not just limited to ash. During the 1250 CE eruption of Mount Mazama, which formed Crater Lake in southern Oregon, pumice was ejected 30 kilometers into the air. Pumice is a type of igneous rock that is full of holes. It forms when gas bubbles get trapped in cooling lava. The bubbles expand as the lava hardens, creating a lightweight rock that can float on water. And while you might think of pumice as a useful tool for exfoliating dead skin, it can also travel surprisingly far. Pumice from Mount Mazama traveled over 600 kilometers before settling to the ground. Some of it even made its way across the Pacific Ocean and landed in Japan. So what happens if you live near a supervolcano? Well, if you're close enough, you'll probably get covered in ash. Depending on the wind conditions, the ash could travel hundreds of kilometers and bury everything in sight. In fact, during the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, ash fell as far away as Australia, more than 2,000 kilometers away. The ash would not only cover buildings and farmland, but it would also block the sun. And depending on how high the ash cloud reaches into the atmosphere, it could block out the sun for years. For example, the 1816 eruption of Mount Tambora led to what is sometimes known as the year without a summer. Ash from the eruption reached 37 kilometers into the atmosphere, and temperatures plummeted as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius below normal. There were widespread crop failures and food shortages, and tens of thousands of people died of starvation and related illnesses. In fact, the eruption is believed to be the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history. But, while ash can cause problems far away from the eruption site, the real danger is close to home. Pyroclastic flows are extremely hot mixtures of gas and solid matter that move extremely fast down the side of a volcano. If you find yourself caught in one, you wouldn't have time to run away. You'd be met with temperatures hotter than a typical crematorium, and gas velocities as high as 100 kilometers per second. Yeah, that's about 360,000 kilometers per hour. Pyroclastic flows are responsible for the vast majority of deaths associated with volcanic eruptions. And the monster eruptions associated with supervolcanoes produce especially deadly pyroclastic flows. And if you're thinking that you could outrun one, well, think again. Pyroclastic flows can travel 60 kilometers in just 15 minutes. So what should you do if you find yourself living near a supervolcano? Well, in addition to stocking up on canned food and bottled water, it might be a good idea to learn how to identify poisonous plants so that you can survive off the land if your crops fail. And if you want to learn more about the world's supervolcanoes, there are plenty of books available. One great option is Supervolcanoes by Lee R. 8. Ruff, which provides a comprehensive overview of these fascinating geological features. Another excellent choice is The Eruption by Simon Winchester, which tells the story of the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, one of the most violent eruptions in recorded history. Of course, there are also documentaries. The Discovery Channel has a great series called Mega Disasters that covers everything from asteroid impacts to volcanic eruptions. And if you want a more in-depth look at supervolcanoes specifically, there's always the classic documentary Supervolcano. But no matter what you choose to watch or read, one thing is certain, you're in for a wild ride. Now check out Why Do We Have Volcanoes, or click this other video instead.